Hello, everyone. Welcome to another event with Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore. Today, I am joined by two wonderful authors. We have Sarah Blake and Matt Bell. Hello, you two.
Hi.
Hi.
So today, we are here for Sarah's latest book, Clean Air. You got your copies ready? There we go. Yay! For those who haven't purchased the book yet, you'll also notice that there's a link below the screen if you're watching this live, mind you. That'll take you to their website and you can get your own copy of Clean Air. Sarah is wonderful and gracious and offering also signed book plates for anyone who buys the book. So you will also get that. Depending on shipping delays, it may come with your book or it may come shortly after. Sarah Blake is the author of novel Naamah, which won the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. She has also written the poetry collections Mr. West and Let's Not Live on Earth. Conversation partner Matt Bell is the author of novels Scraper, long title, so excuse me, In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall, which is a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate and several other titles. And his most recent novel is Appleseed. Today, though, we are here for Sarah's book Clean Air, a blend of patroning mystery, commentary on environmental destruction, and more. I am going to disappear now and let our lovely authors, Sarah and Matt, take it away, but I'll see you all later in the event. Bye.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's so good to be with you. It's my pleasure, obviously, to be here with you today and to talk to you about Clean Air. For people in the audience who haven't read Clean Air yet, it's a fantastic new novel. It's part climate apocalypse, part parenting tale, part murder mystery, a fascinating combination of genres and subjects. The story begins in the aftermath of the turning, an unexpected climate apocalypse in which the world's trees mysteriously start creating so much pollen that it's impossible for many people to breathe. Half the world's population dies, we learn on page 1, but Isabel, our protagonist, writes, the resulting world, the world we built from scratch, it's not how I was taught a post-apocalyptic world would be. It presents itself like a gift. Which I think I'll want to ask you more about later. But I was hoping so we could get started and so we could tell people who haven't read the novel yet, if you could give us a glimpse of your writing process and how you came to this book. Where did the idea for the turning come from? Where did you begin in this invented future?
Yeah, so it began because my allergies started getting really bad. And I ended up in the emergency room with asthma that I couldn't get under control the way I usually did with like a rescue inhaler. And I started getting allergy shots. Like I really went all the way back to an allergist, back to a pulmonologist, did all the steps. And when I was when you get allergy shots, you have to sit and wait for 30 minutes to make sure you don't have some sort of awful reaction. So it's a lot of time to sit and think and to be around all these other people who also are getting these. And you hear a lot of conversations about pollen and allergies. And there are charts up on the wall about like what's in bloom, like what's causing the worst of things right now. And there's and it just really changed how I was thinking about things. And I felt like every time I went out, I would overhear someone going, oh, it's worse this year. It's worse this year. And I was like, well, what if it really got all the way worse? And everybody was having breathing problems like I was and ending up in hospitals and had asthma or other breathing related problems. So that's where it started. And I think one of the reasons it felt a little safe to write that was because of the unlikelihood of that. There's a bit of magic to it, a bit of agency towards the plants that it felt like vengeful and fun and twisty, but also obviously terrible. So it's a line that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this idea of it being like safe to explore because it probably won't happen, right? Like there's something that I was trying to find one of the exact passages I was thinking of today, and I couldn't find it in the book, but there are these instances where Isabel thinks about how she and other people prepared for futures that didn't arrive because the turning happens, right? So, sea level rise doesn't happen in the same way, or we don't end up in some of these other like dire worst case scenarios. And it's this really interesting sort of scenario then where the turning is obviously also a bad thing. Like half the people in the world die. Like that's not good. But there's something really interesting about the worst case scenario being other than we expected. In scenario planning, there's sometimes this thing where you're supposed to make a plan for like the best possible outcome and then like the worst possible outcome and then like a weird outcome. Like a thing, like the unexpected thing. And it feels like the turning is like the weird scenario in the like climate apocalypse planning kit.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like the kind of research you did while you were sort of developing that?
Yeah. So obviously I went off of some of the experiences I was having in my pulmonologist's office and allergist office. But also I overheard other people talking about how you could track pollen counts. So I started going on those websites and looking at that. In the midst of somewhere in there, I was moving to the UK and I thought, oh, I have to switch over because I was 3 years in, I think, to my shots, and they become less and less frequent. It's like every week and then every 2 weeks and then once a month. And it's you're kind of done around year 3, but you're supposed to go to year 5 so you don't rebound. It just makes rebounding way less likely to happen. And I was like, so can I switch this over there and continue my upkeep? I don't, and they were like, oh, you don't really have to worry about it over there because there's so much less biodiversity in terms of like what you're going to be exposed to, that if you need anything, they'll do less of like a buckshot allergy shot for you. And then I did a lot of research that had to do more with space, oddly, because I really love the idea of these airtight domes. I remember my first experience of something it's not really like it, but my dad loves field hockey and took me to one of these giant domes that they have all covered up, that you like go through a revolving door and your ears pop and the air smells and tastes different. And I was like, oh, this is like a very strange environment. This is like, it's always this perfect temperature and everything about it just feels like very, very perfect. And that doesn't feel good though. Like there's no good feeling to that kind of super controlled air. So I was really interested in that. But then that led me to look at these like practice areas they've set up in deserts to seem like Mars, or practice areas they've set up underwater to seem like space, and just kind of anywhere where they had super controlled environments and what that looks like or could look like. So that was fun. And and then I did a lot of firsthand research. I interviewed a bunch of people that I thought would be cool to interview. So I interviewed someone who's a city planner in Newark, and I interviewed a child trauma therapist. And I actually went and got a tarot card reading for when my character got one. So like I did all sorts of bizarre research that came up along the way, and then things that were more just for me and fun for me to think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's half the reason to write a novel, right? Is like to just have that experience where you get to like think over a long period of time about something and learn about it and sort of be with it. I really, I feel like more and more I enjoy the experience of like, even as you're solving plot problems, you're continuing to think about the like issues or themes of the book, and that way that it's like a long form exploration into something you're interested in. Seems really important.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, just that, like, some of that was interesting, how it came about with just like things I'm intrigued by, like self-driving cars, and how I was hearing about them being in Las Vegas, and I just ended up looking into those more. So it's all these things that you're like, I wonder what that would be like. And the only way I could think of that as being safe is if there were no other drivers on the road.
In
but
Appleseed,
then I think it worked really well.
There's places where it's like illegal to drive, only self-driving cars are allowed to go. It's that same thing, right? The self-driving car seems like a bad idea if humans are involved, and kind of fine if they're not. I totally agree. Both came to that same conclusion in the same like time period, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting that'll work as long as humans aren't part of it, which is true maybe of a lot of things. I want to ask you to read a little bit from the book so people can sort of hear in your voice, so I can hear it in your voice, which I'm excited about. Before I have you read, I just also wanted to say, like, there is like an ask a question button, and people can put questions in it now. and we'll come to those at like the half-hour mark. We'll start bringing in reader questions. So please feel free to ask questions. And while Sarah's reading, if you want to emote and cheer and sort of be excited in the chat, I think that's always a nice energy because we can't see you. Okay, Sarah, I will get out of your way, and I'd love to hear a little bit of Clean Air.
Yeah, so I picked two little sections that I like for different reasons. One of the most difficult parts of revising this book was getting across this new world, which was so perfectly clear in my head, but I was realizing to other people was not so. So this was one of those moments where I really wanted to make it clear how dangerous it was to be outside. So this is, and we're about halfway through, but I don't think it gives away anything. But Isabel has had kind of a traumatic experience as she's come across this killer that's going around town, and she's moved in. She's convinced now that the killer knows where she lives. Her and her family live, so they've moved in with one of her new friends, Andy, and her daughter Hestia. So you'll hear those names and that. So everybody's kind of making a go of things right now. And the main characters then are Isabel, her husband Kaito, and her daughter Cami. The next day, Isabel thought she'd be able to let Cami go to school if she went along in the car with her and Hestia. Andy said she'd go too. And everything went fine inside, putting on shoes and masks and backpacks. Even through the double doors, Isabel felt okay. But as Isabel got closer and closer to the car, she panicked. Her knees buckled and she dropped to the ground. "Mom," Cami said. "Your mom is okay," Andy said, putting her body between Isabel and the girls. In an extra cheery voice, she said, "You girls, go to school now." She slammed the car door shut as soon as both girls were in. As the car drove off, she grabbed Isabel's arm and put it around her shoulders. "You can do it," Andy said. "Back to the house now." In the house, Isabel stayed on the floor near the door. And Andy got a hand towel, ran it under water, and wrung it out. She brought it back to Isabel, got down next to her on the floor, and wiped the pollen off her knees. Kaito came out of the bathroom. "Jesus, what happened?" "She's not ready to go in a car yet," Andy said. Kaito carried Isabel back to their futon and laid her down. "You're okay," he said. "Will Cami be okay at school?" Isabel said. "Of course she will be." Isabel nodded. "I want her to come back." "That's not what's best for her." "I know," she said, teary. He said, "What can I do?" She shook her head. He crawled into bed next to her and held her, and she fell asleep again. And then I'm going to jump to a part that I got to read the other day, and I had so much fun reading it that I was like, I've got to read this one again. Yeah. As if you've read the book, you know that one of the best characters is Inspector Paz, because she's just this fast-talking woman who's hilarious. Like, she just has no filter. I adore her. She's really great to watch. So, or to write. So let's see. So this is an even weirder thing has happened now, where Isabel's had an experience with a medium to get more info about the case, which Paz really doesn't want any part in, but she has to. She has to get information where she can. So Isabel's kind of freaked out, and she's going back. She's trying to get back in to see the medium again, and Paz won't let her. Paz took Isabel's shoulders and pushed her into the nearest room. "You don't need shit from her right now. She's in there with my boss, and I need you to pull yourself together." Isabel was shaking. "Fuck you. You better remember who you're talking to." Isabel started looking around the room Paz had pushed her into. It was an arms room, and there were guns, lots of guns, handguns tagged on a table, rifles upright in a rack. Isabel started to panic. "I'm not okay," she said. "You're fine," Paz said. "You're more than fine. You were already my only witness, and now with all that shit that just came out of your mouth, it doesn't matter how Lucy explains it. You're my star witness." Isabel shook her head. "No, I'm not." Paz grabbed Isabel's head with both hands and held it still. "Yes, you are." There was something tender about having her head in Paz's hands, even if it was also shockingly intimidating. And then they both heard someone yell for Paz. She let go of Isabel and stepped one foot out of the room. In those seconds, Isabel grabbed a handgun and put it in her bag. Paz yelled, "I'm coming," and came back to Isabel. "Look, my boss wants to meet you. I said no another day, but now you're still here. Christ, can you do this?" "I have a medicine in my purse I'm supposed to take." "Then take it. Now?" Paz nodded. Isabel took out the bottle, pushed down the child lock, took out a pill, shoved it in her mouth, and let it dissolve on her tongue. "Oh no," she said. "What?" "It tastes like orange," Isabel said. "I hate orange." "You've never taken one before?" Isabel shook her head. "What if it makes you all loopy?" "I don't know." "You're a mess," Paz said. Isabel didn't say anything. She focused on her breath and how horrible the medicine tasted. It felt like it was sliding into that space between her back molars and her cheek. She ran her tongue back there. It felt like her mouth would taste bad forever. "Better?" Paz said. "I don't think it works instantly," Isabel said. "I'm walking you in there, and they're going to make a fuss, and you are going to act like the hero you are." "I'm not." Paz yelled. "Are you listening to me, Isabel?" "Yeah," Isabel said. "Yeah, I'm a hero. I'm your witness." "Good," Paz said. And they left the room and all the guns in their matte medals.
Thank you, Sarah. One of the weirdest parts of all these online events is being the sole audience member the person can see or hear, but I know everybody else is sort of clapping in their own spaces. So thank you so much for that. I remember that the second scene really vividly, especially that part where Paz like takes Isabel's head in sort of this like aggressive but tender move, and like somehow I'm going to remember that gesture for a really long time. I really stuck with me. I listened to the book. I switched between the audiobook and reading the book as I was getting ready for this. And I listened to that part and I was running. As you started reading it, I saw like the road that I ran on when I heard it. It was like a weird kind of memory palace thing. Probably getting a lot of pollen myself.
Right. Yeah.
I think this challenge you had of like of making the pollen seem dangerous is like an interesting one, right? Because I mean, so many people do suffer from allergies and do have these things, and we all do a little, I think, even if it's not as dramatic. I remember as reading the book, there's these scenes with the pollen all over the cars or all over the masks and things. You're talking about wiping the masks, and pollen is also like beautiful in like at least an abstract sort of way if you're not a person who's in danger from it, right? It does a really interesting task in that way. So what were some of the things you had to change to make it seem more dangerous? Where were the places that did create that danger for your editors or your agent as you were revising?
Yeah, I mean, because that's it. It has this really amazing scene later in the book where they've actually did stay out too long, and when they come back in, they have to wipe it off their eyelashes. They have to wipe it off their hair, and all of a sudden it becomes very clear. But you can't have that moment early in the book, or it gives away too much.
Yeah.
So it was. I think I just tried to add more about when you'd see it around town, what would change about the domes? Like the town is clean. Do you get the sense of like regularly so that it doesn't build up so intensely? So like some days it's yellow and some days it's gray and some days it's crusty and some, and it's always in the air in this really bizarre way. I like to watch those videos of people that like bonk into a tree and then the pollen goes crazy, or they cut a tree down, it falls, and I'm just trying to imagine like, okay, but you're standing right there. You wouldn't want to breathe that in.
I feel like I sometimes post pictures of like that yellow carpeting around a tree, and I'm just like, oh, this is so beautiful, and immediately like all the like severe allergy sufferers were like, this is my nightmare. Like that's sort of the way you don't always see the danger other people see seems to be part of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I had one of these deaths happen just because they hadn't worked out the quirks yet so they discovered a body in one of the self-driving cars. So like, obviously it's something, because if you go on a longer trip, you have to change an air filter yourself because they just kind of have air filters and the car will just alert you. And I had the sense in my head that everything's getting changed like pretty rapidly. It's just to, make it less likely that anyone dies if they can. So that I tried to do it like that, just dropping in little hints. I still think it catches people a little off guard till they get to that scene where they really are covered in it and what that's like. But I knew they had to, I didn't want her just in a house all day. So I had to have her go out But I do wonder if someone were to try to make this into a movie or something, if really there'd actually be like special clothing and all these things, like how you'd really deal with like that much pollen.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting because you as a person who suffers from allergies are, that severely, are also like you are mediating yourself in the world already, right? And I mean, we all have some version of that. I live in Phoenix in the summer when it's, 115 degrees out. Like going out is like, there are like things you do to get ready, right? And there are like the ways you prepare for the day in the same way you do in cold weather. And like I think it's very relatable, even though it's an extreme scenario, because we do so much of it. I wanted to ask you about, you read a little bit, this is the first passage, about the way the book treats like child trauma. I think actually one of the things I really love about the book is Cami is traumatized and dealing with these different sort of, she's talking in her sleep, and there's something sort of mysterious about it through the book, but the way in which Isabel tries to get care for or to care for her feels really well done. And actually, outside of the sort of climate future stuff and the murder mystery, I was like, oh, this is like a really like tender novel about child trauma as well. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your approach to that, or how you were thinking about that as you were writing.
Yeah, that was like, thank God for one of my friends who is a child trauma therapist, because I knew nothing about that. I've done therapy on and off since I was 15, but I've never had a good therapist, I don't think. It's just never worked out well for me, but I've tried. Over 20 years of trying. Luckily the medication does what it's supposed to do. I would be in way worse spots. And group therapy's been nice. I've had some good group therapists. So I when I realized that the thing you'd probably do if your child was having a sleep problem was that you'd end up with a child therapist, and then you think about this world where there's probably not enough people to have someone who does the sleep problem and someone who does the trauma, and so you're going to get someone who's kind of a catch-all but is good with children. and has that kind of focus. So Opa came to me, and then I just did a ton of I really just said to my friend, I was like, just run me through what a whole session would be and what you do. And because there were things that I had no idea she would ask. She's like, you'd ask about the birth. I was like, the birth? I was like, what did I do wrong then? Like, I didn't even know that I could have done anything right or wrong. Like, I was like, could I have messed things up that I didn't even know about? Because luckily my son's been fine, but he did have really funny sleep problems when he was little, but only all very predictable. Like if he was transitioning out of nap, then he'd have night terrors, and they were just exactly what you read about online. Because I was like, what is this? Because I'm the oldest of 5 kids, so I've seen a lot of things in the night. Yeah. But I'd never seen a night terror, and he would just like wide awake. It looked like screaming his head up and then back to sleep. And you're just like, what? And you're like trying to talk to them, and they are acting like they're not awake because they're not awake. And it's just like, what is happening? But luckily it never persisted. It was like the 2 nights where he was transitioning to some new sleep schedule, and then it'd be done. And then it wouldn't happen again until he did it again. So this kind of persistent problem was really interesting to kind of think about. And then I loved all of her exercise. Like she gave me all the exercises about like the breathing elevator and the thermometer and playing with things with dolls. Because I'd seen some of this stuff on like Law and Order SVU, but like not probably the most realistic portrayals of those things. So it was really interesting to kind of talk. And again, I think it helped me to talk about that, knowing that wasn't actually what was happening with Cami. Like, Cami is a bit traumatized, but her sleep talking's for a totally different reason. Right. And then it turns out, Isabel is just as traumatized as anybody else, which the therapist realizes right off. She's like, there's more of a problem here than what we're dealing with. And she has every right to be. So I really liked the idea of trying to portray anxiety and panic attacks. I've been trying to do it more and more in my work as I've gotten older, because I didn't realize how little there are of like very accurate portrayals of what that can look like in books. even in TV shows, I'm always mad about TV shows showing like experiences in inpatient facilities, because I've been hospitalized twice, and like they're always like bonkers. I'm like, that's not what it's like at all. So yeah, so I really wanted to kind of get into that, and I think it helped too when I published Let's Not Live on Earth. There's a lot of poems about anxiety in that book, and a lot of students wrote to me specifically about that and how important it was to see that. And sometimes I was talking to a professor who was like, "Oh, I'm going to teach that book, and like, what do you think you'll want to talk about?" I was like, "Well, the students are definitely going to want to talk about the mental health stuff." And she was like, "What?" I was like, "Just you'll see." And she was like, "You were right." That's like the primary thing. They were like really wanted to talk, because the whole book even talks about, like, it opens with this poem about being at a train station that has all these new signs up for suicide prevention hotlines, and how I was glad my son couldn't read yet, because I didn't know like how to explain, like, this is a place people come to jump in front of a train. Like, it's like, like what? Like, how do you explain that to a 3 to 4 year old? But yeah, so I think, a lot of this came from my young motherhood things, the things that came out of his mouth, the things that I was dealing with. Because a lot of the stories that are Cammy's stories are just things that he did, or a friend of his did, or a neighbor did. Like, he's the one who just one day was like, "Oh, would you put flowers on my grave?" And I was like, "You just dropped that like it was a normal question." Okay, cool. I'm gonna keep my cool.
You depict so well that moment too, when like the line of inquiry ends for the child, and the parents like, "Oh," like, you know, it's just like, okay, solved, and just moves on with their day, and you're still thinking about it, 2 years later or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love all. Yeah.
So go ahead, please.
No, I loved every weird thing he was saying and doing. I think about the cliff moment all the time, where Cammy's convinced you would, she asks Isabel how you spell cliff, and then they talk about what positions you'd imagine in a cliff, and Cammy thinks you'd always imagine yourself at the bottom of a cliff, and Isabel's like, "No, you'd always imagine yourself at the top of a cliff." And it was just such like a tiny moment, but it's one that I really loved.
Yeah, I love that. One of the place, I think Isabel writes these letters that she often goes to this like privacy pod in the mall, and she can be alone, and she goes there to vent and scream, and she writes these letters to Cammy that she shreds mostly. There's one where she says, thinking about Cammy in her relationship to animals. I'll just read like a little bit of it, but she says, "Dear Cammy, I thought you would grow up spending a lot of time looking at windows and asking me questions about animals and what it used to be like. I was going to tell you about bird calls and squirrels and stopping to look at caterpillars and accidentally racing crickets that didn't know how to get out of your way on the sidewalk. But that's not what it's like with you at all. And I think I'm grateful for that." And I think I've thought about that passage a lot, just like almost like the mercy of like these kids in this imagined future, like not having to miss the things we're seeing, or the extinction events we're living through, and not having, like, Isabel is traumatized by that, and we're maybe traumatized by that living through it, but children in the future won't have to know that or see it. And it feels like awful that they won't know bird calls and things in this future, but they don't even know they don't know it, right? I find that incredibly affecting in the book, and I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah, I think about that with the end of WALL-E.
Yeah.
And when they like kind of start researching again what Earth was like, because they've forgotten about it, and they're all excited about all these things, but really I'm thinking of a child that's more in the mode of like, well, you wouldn't really go look any of those things up. You're just living your life. Like, you're not missing anything. And I think about that a lot with like what we're going through right now. And I mean, my son did say something to me the other day where he's like, I feel bad for the kids that are younger.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see all these toddlers around, and he's like, they don't know about it both ways. And I was like, oh, he's like already having an Isabel moment.
Yeah.
And he's
not very old, right? He's
10 now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Absolutely. And he's right, but it's amazing that that's the case. I think I just want to ask maybe one more question, and I know we have questions piling up, so I think we should switch to those. We haven't talked a ton about it, but the novel's like top level plot focuses on a serial killer who's murdering not directly, by like cutting these airtight pods and letting people die from the pollen. And I think one of the questions the book asks is like why a person would murder in a world where so much death has already happened. And I was thinking that like that seems like one of the big science fiction questions sometimes, is people are looking for like, what would be an event that's big enough that would finally actually bring everybody together in like a common humanity? Like the plot of Watchmen moves toward one of those events, right? Like this is, we're going to trick everybody into believing aliens are invading so that we'll all bond together. But so I was wondering like how you sort of saw this post-turning world, like killer accepted. Are the people in this world more bonded together than people in our time? There's propaganda telling them they should be, but that doesn't mean they are. Are we waiting in vain if we hope some outside thing will bond us, or do we just have to do it irregardless?
Yeah, I mean, what I found really interesting about like when I think back about the type of killer I made and why I made him, I think a lot actually about shootings and a kind of, it's really not a serial killer. Like Posner doesn't really use that word to describe him because there's not oh, sorry, I've got so much this cold going on. There's not torture, there's not gore, there's not stalking, there's not sexual gratification, there's not like all the things there's not a cooling off period, there's not a pattern, there's not like all the things you'd expect to see. Like he doesn't have it, but he does have an urge to kill. And it was really interesting to think about like what would be the motivation behind that. And I almost stopped writing the book in about the middle when I was like, because the serial killer as part of the background made sense to me, as part of world building made sense to me. That I could wrap my head around. But once I had to write the story towards what really was happening, which was her family was being threatened, and someone would have to figure it out. And so but luckily, right around that time, Mindhunter came out, and it like saved me because I fell in love with so many fictional, wonderful, creative, super like criminal mastermind serial killers in TV shows. And I was like, do I have to write that? Because that seems really intimidating. But really, when I got into Mindhunter and thinking more about the serial killers, we know when it gets to the point that a serial killer is interested in being caught, it's a very different kind of game that played, and it's a different kind of connection that they're seeking. So the killer here is kind of he's just a really interesting character in that he's so utterly uninteresting. Like he's traumatized himself, just like Isabella is, and that's what she uses to kind of try to figure him out, both for herself before she meets him and afterwards. And it becomes it always was her story, so it stays her story. So like that was really important to me. And I also, but it was something I fought with the whole time. Like the first draft, they do not ever come across the killer before the end, because that's really what police investigations are like. You didn't you didn't stand behind that guy in line at coffee, like not that she did, not to give anything away. I'm making
watch the coffee shop, people.
But yeah, you do your investigation, it leads you to somebody, and then you meet them for the first time in that interrogation room. Like there's not all these fun, fancy ways. But that is what we like to enjoy. So it became a lot of like, all right, well, what do I want as a novelist? And then what do I want in terms of like realism? And then what do I want in terms of my main character? And and there's a lot of ethical questions, I think, when you're dealing with killers and why they're enjoyable and why we enjoy them. And like, are we glorifying violence, and in what ways? And so I'm kind of shocked I wrote this book, but of course I did. It's like my favorite television to watch ever. To read these and books. All of my childhood was reading different murder mystery series, like anything I could get my hands on. So
I think I tell students all the time that the real trick to writing a novel is just to fill it with things you love, right? Like putting in that's how you get through it, Otherwise, why would you even be bothering,
Yeah, exactly. You have to enjoy your time at the page every day or you won't keep coming back. So that's, I fall in love with my main character. I like the world that I've built and I find interesting things all around it. And then, I just keep filling it with things that I love. And I tell people usually that when I get bored, I write dialogue or I write sex. Like those are my two favorites.
I feel like that's a good tactic, right?
Yeah. Even if that doesn't make it to the final draft, you have fun that day.
Absolutely. This seems like a great place to sort of transition into questions. So we have some questions already. If you're listening and you want to ask questions, and there's the ask a question box, and I'm going to sort and ask as we go here. Kai Azarel asked a question about the tarot reading you were talking about. And you said, Kai says, I'd love to know more about the tarot reading you got for your character. What was your reading? Did you go in saying, I'm writing a book and this reading is for the character, or was it for you?
Yeah, so I emailed someone that had really good reviews online who was really close to my house, and I said, I'd really love to do this thing where I'm my character getting a reading at this point in my story. And she was like, yeah, I've done that for people before. I was like, okay, great. So I went in. She did a little bit of a reading for me because I think we had an hour and she knew it wouldn't be that whole expanse. But I don't, we talked a little bit. She's predicted that I would switch presses between my first book and my second book. She said that that was right there in the cards. And I was like, what? I was like, I'm not even thinking about that yet. I was like, never mind. Let's focus on the character. So then we kind of wiped the slate clean and started again. And, I'd never done it before, so I really loved it. And, you hold the cards and she kind of took me through this guided meditation, and all the things that I had happen to Isabel happened to me. Like the cards felt really heavy and weird. And then I gave them back. And I didn't do all the weird things. Like when I did it, I picked the wrong amount of cards. And then when I did it as Isabel, I picked the right amount of cards. I was like, I'm terrible at this. This is just counting. And somehow I'm messing this up. What was crazy is I didn't tell her that much about the book. I kind of told her about the character a little bit. I told her that what we were going to do. I hadn't written past the tarot reading. I really wanted it to guide the story. I wanted to see what would happen. And we just kind of both, as she flipped over these cards, got totally spooked. Every card looked terrifying until the last three. And the first thing she looked up and said, are you killing people off in this book? And I was like, yeah, it's about a serial killer. She's like, oh, okay. So it was eerily spot on. I didn't change any card. I don't know enough about tarot to have changed anything. So it is that reading. The characters are really different than me and the reader, obviously, that I worked with, but the cards and the reading are exactly what it was. And it gave me a whole sense of, she was like, for sure, this character, which I was pretty sure was the killer, knows her already. And I was like, what? No, he doesn't. And that changed my whole sense of how they might know each other and continue to or not as the story continued. She even knew from the cards that he had been a surgeon. She's like, is her husband a surgeon? I was like, how is this happening? So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience, and I'm really glad I did it. And there are a bunch of things that I kind of snuck into the book that are things I've heard about and loved. I love the Whirling Dervishes since I was in 8th grade and did a project on them. And this kid in high school found out through my mom that I'd done a project on them and handed me a CD of all their music. And then I started to listen into Whirling Dervish music. And so I've always been interested in all the different kinds of spirituality and mysticism that I felt never went in my bubble. If I hadn't looked out for it, it would have never come in. And the medium is actually based on, I had a friend when I was little, and her mom was kind of that kind of famous medium around town, and everybody knew it. I didn't know it. And when I was at her house one day for a play date, she started slipping into voices, and and I don't even really remember that, but my mom said I came home and like told her all about it, and I don't think we had too many more play dates after that. But I just kind of loved that idea that there would be this, a small enough town that like the person in town who's got that connection is known.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, I love the idea that both like like you yelped immediately, you yelped a tarot reading, and it was like the person are also like all the other novelists in your neighborhood use. Seems really great. Whoever those people are. Nick asked a question. When you began work, when did you begin working in clean air, and did the last 2 years of COVID influence the sort of writing a revision of the book?
Yeah, so I started it in 2017. It was basically right after I finished Naamah, and I started querying agents, and I thought, no one is ever going to publish this book. It's too weird. And there's, a biblical retelling filled with sex I was like, no one's going to want this. Like, that
I
was
feel like
fun.
that book's so pitchable. It's so easy to explain.
Now that I know that now, like where I've had this book, which takes like me a good 4 sentences.
Right, this one's much harder to explain than that was. Yeah.
But I was like, no one's gonna take that. So I immediately was like, I want to keep going. I want to do this again. Like, this was the best experience ever, was to sink into a fictional world every day. So it was mostly in 2017. Someone brought up the California wildfires up top, and that was a large inspiration to it. Was seeing all my friends talk about access to masks and needing them to send their kids to school, and how there were all these rules up there at the time because of the smoke about if the kids weren't allowed to come to school without their masks. And there were all these pictures. There were pictures of the fires, and there were pictures of children in masks. And this is all way before COVID. So a lot of that was inspiration for how I thought this would work in this world, but with pollen instead of smoke and ash. And that's why I have some of that in the book too, with like some of the Oregon wildfires. And especially some that are started, where some are traced back to like a lightning storm or whatever, but a bunch are traced back to like a high schooler throwing a firework somewhere. And it's like, oh God.
The gender reveal party wildfires. And,
right. Like, oh God. It's like, no. Yeah. I thought it was going to change a lot when I was in revisions in these past few years. And I was saving like every email that came through and every article that looked interesting. And I thought about how all these things happened that I had not predicted. I didn't know we'd be nuts for toilet paper in the UK. Baked beans were gone because it's staple here. I think everywhere flour was gone. Everybody thought that all these I didn't have access to flour for a long time, but there were still like pancake mixes and other things.
That's how it was here too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm like, well, this is mostly, yeah, exactly, yeah. Like this is mostly flour, So, but we figured it out. But I remember
it's interesting thinking about like the one thing that maybe the COVID version of masks that's different that you probably couldn't have predicted in some ways, or maybe we could have or should have, but is like the resistance of like half the people everywhere to do the thing that keeps people safe, right? Which is not really happening in your world, and people would just die if they did it, immediately. So maybe that's the resistors are gone in the post-turning world. But it is an interesting, and it would break the book to add. There's no reason to revise that in, right? But it is an interesting. People are more compliant in your world than they are in ours.
Yeah. I think that was a big part of it that I really like, because I got really spooked by dystopic fiction, especially like I was a long-term substitute and had to teach The Road, which I had told myself I would like never read. I was like, that book's gonna scare the crap out of me. And then here I was teaching it, and I was like, and it did scare me.
Yeah. As it should.
Yeah, and I think so when I was thinking about a dystopic world, I was like, I want one where like people can't just turn into weird gangs that fight each other for the leftover resources. Like that, I want that to be impossible and see where we're pushed to from there instead. You know, like you can't riot and you can't just break a window and go get food. Like you're stuck wherever you are. If you've survived this long, you're stuck there, and you're gonna have to depend on some kind of infrastructure, community, like problem solving, like whatever. Like, and I thought it was really interesting, but also it took a lot of the fear away from me. Like I did, a lot of that is just, I mean, I just read a children's Bible too. I say just like a while ago, but I don't care. It's all in there. And that when the men show up with guns is like, oh my God. I was like, no, this is the part that's always the worst.
Right.
and it does go badly. But yeah, so I was really curious in like what I could do to avoid that, but then still have problems, but to look at what those problems were that were scary in their own way, but at least I came upon them anew.
Right. Well, you know, I was thinking, I've been kind of obsessed over the last couple of years with places in dystopic fiction where people improve the world in some way. So like, you know, the overall situation is bad. That's why it's a novel, but but it doesn't mean you can't improve some things as you go. Like there's certainly some of those in Appleseed, which is, you know, like about the end of humanity, but is also like, here's some things in between that were like better than they are in 2020, you know? And I think like there's a universal basic income in your world, for instance, right? You know, that, and sort of talk about like how people are incentivized to do essential jobs. It's like a pretty small part of the book, just like it's thought about for a minute. But even that, I was like, oh, like Sarah's book is a great example of like letting you imagine what it would be like to live in a society where we had a universal basic income. People either chose to work or for whatever reason, no one was like forced to work or exploited into working, you know? And I think that's a really admirable subtext that's through this whole book is the way that you're sort of imagining imagining better parts of imagining things we might want to do in our world implemented.
Yeah. That's like my dream. I'm like, can someone just, I don't need much, but I'd really like to just write my books and still be able to eat. I don't, it's all I need.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously would be so many more people who could live, you know, lives of sort of art making if that was the case, right? You know, I think that's absolutely the case. Nick also asked a question about if there was a particular scene or interesting factoid you tried to write into the book but ended up on the cutting room floor. I always love this question for science fiction, thinking about Le Guin in The Dispossessed had these like pickles that people were always eating, and she had made up this idea about communal pickle barrels where everybody was pickling things and sharing them with each other, but she couldn't, you know, like that doesn't need to be in the book. And she would talk about that in interviews all the time. She's like, that pickle barrel, I just couldn't fit in. So what's your pickle barrel?
Oh yeah, I'm not sure, because I'm such a underwriter. Like it's hard for me to reach word counts. Like I'm so spare. I think that's the poet in me. I know a lot of people think it would be the other way, that I'd really enjoy like language and sound. And like, no, I'm like, get to the point. I'm really interested in like logical twists and turns and like getting things as quick as I can into a paragraph or a moment or a scene, and then moving on. And so there's not too much. There's things that happened. Like I drew a lot of pictures and I had a lot of things mapped out just in terms of, so I could keep consistency with like when they were walking around their house. I wanted to make sure every room was where it was supposed to be. And with the town too, when I met with the city planner, there were a few things I had missed. He's like, you would really need a waste disposal treatment center. You really need a water treatment center. And I was like, okay, I could mention this. But then when I went through the scene again, where she's kind of taking her long drive and thinking about things, and that's that moment where she's thinking about the people who are incentivized to work in the warehouses and chop up food into nice sized portions and whatever. She thinks about them again later, I think, when they're at the kind of fancy people's house. And she's imagining how they got so fancy. And so, yeah, so there are a bunch of like things that I definitely thought out that didn't end up needing to be in the book, but none were that fun. I think if it was really fun, I tried to get it.
Yeah. I love that. Kai Zarel also asked about the book cover, which I think is for people who haven't seen it in a second, it looks like this. I was asking about the different colored blueberries, which do come up in the book, and I think it's a really striking, interesting cover. But pre-reading the book, it's hard to know what it is. Maybe you can talk about the blueberries in the book.
Yeah, I'd love to know
Right.
why we ended up on this. I wasn't shown any other options. I was told that there were other things kicked around, but this is where they ended up. And I don't, the produce is huge in the book. The produce is thriving. The world is thriving without humans mucking it up so bad. Everything's doing great. And as long as we've figured out how to man these robots to get in and out and around and to get all this food, then there is plenty of food for the world. Hunger is not an issue anymore, which is really fun. And it makes for some quirky things in terms of thinking about prepping like snacks for a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Like you wouldn't cut up a whole apple if the apple's giant, so that comes up a bunch, and the blueberries come up a bunch, or well, not really, they comes up one time. And but I was like, okay, I could see them being different colors. Like, we're not really, if the plants have really they're doing whatever they want to do right now, I could see that. But I didn't ever actually mention that, and I didn't change it once we had that artwork. And then we had to change the artwork a little bit, and I was like, are we going to change the whole thing? I don't know. But I loved it. I just thought it was striking and weird, and that's more like, it fits the vibes of the book more than anything in particular, of like, this is a weird world that's a little bit magical. And even though that's not going to be at the forefront of much of the story, I think maybe on a second reread you would see all the places it was, and then you'd be like, okay. But you wouldn't get so many, like, there's still just one or two places that mentions blueberries. So
I mean, I think it's funny because these things can become like really attached to books in weird ways. Like in like 50 years, people will be wearing like blueberry t-shirts to your readings or something,
Yeah.
It's like these like bizarre sort of things that become part of like the iconography of like your body of work or something in odd ways.
Yeah,
Which are not intended.
Yeah, with Naamah, I thought putting the tiger on the front changed the whole book, even for me reading through it. Like, I noticed the tiger so much more every time. And but it changed in a way that really made sense, because the tiger is really pivotal in that story. I think this it's less pivotal, but it's it does call attention to this moment. And there's this great moment where Cammie's like this great example of a kid who's just kind of a mess of cultures, and because her dad's Japanese American and remembers lots of stories, where her mom is a little bit more removed, or Uruguayan, I don't know how I would say that, American, but her mother didn't really pass down stories. Like, she passed down a little bit of the language, a little bit of songs, but she doesn't have this connection to culture. And she's really envious of Kaito for having such a strong connection and being able to tell Cammie all these fairy tales that she loves. And they're gruesome, and they're funny, and they're magical. And they talk about them as a family sometimes. And at one point, Cammie holds up a blueberry and she calls it obake, or I'm probably going to say it wrong, but it's something that Isabel thinks she's saying is just like, look how huge it is. But actually it's a word that means a little bit more like monstrous. So like, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's fun for me. Like, you can look it up if you want, but that moment might kind of go over. But because it would be a word that Kaito recognizes more than Isabel would recognize. So I try to have like really delicate moments, I feel like I would describe them as throughout. And so those are things.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think it's great. It's so, I mean, as you were saying before, so much of this is like entertaining yourself while you're writing, or having these things that make you sort of happy. Some of the smallest things in my books that no one's ever going to notice or talk about are like, but like there's weirdly sometimes the things I remember like 10 years after a book comes out, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, like I put that joke in there, that was funny, and like no one cares, and it seems really great. It also feels great when this part where as you're in the middle of your book tour and you're in the middle of doing your events, like is very like public facing and is very like, what are people getting? What are people liking? Are they liking it? Are they getting it? You know, and then those things that are like really for you can feel so sustaining in this time. I know we're just about at our time. Nick's going to come back out and interrupt us in just a minute and tell everybody to buy your book, which I think they should absolutely do if they have not already. Thank you so much for talking to me, Sarah. This is really fantastic, and I'm such a fan of your work, and it's just like really a pleasure to get to talk about this novel with you today, from across the ocean. So thanks so much for asking me to be here with you.
Yeah, it's been nobody knows this, but like we met when you came and read when I was in grad school, like over a decade
right.
ago. And I was like, and I've just been smitten with your work since then. So like that we're getting to have this moment is really crazy for me, because I'm like, wait, I just got to like take you out to dinner one time after you read to us.
It's lovely. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's a wonderful memory. Oh, Sarah, thank you so much for being here and talking about your book. Matt, thank you so much for being a wonderful conversation partner. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate all of you who are watching either now or in the future. And at any point in time, you can definitely get your own copy of Clean Air. And we have, or will have, signed book plates from Sarah while supplies last for you with your purchase. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll all see you next time. Have a great day, Sarah, and have a great day, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, bye.